Adam Schiff walked into the hearing room carrying himself like a man convinced the argument had already been settled before the first question was asked, and when he accused Senator John Kennedy of having no moral authority to question anyone, dismissed him as a Maggie instrument, and framed the entire proceeding as another chapter in the weaponization of American institutions, he was not merely criticizing Kennedy, he was attempting to seize control of the moral frame before the evidence ever reached the table. The posture was familiar, polished, prosecutorial, almost clinically rehearsed, the kind of Washington performance designed to make accusations sound like conclusion and confidence, look like proof, with every phrase sharpened to suggest that Schiff represented institutional seriousness while Kennedy represented partisan contamination. Kennedy did not interrupt, did not compete for volume, did not perform outrage for the cameras, and did not waste a second trying to out-theater a politician who had spent years mastering televised combat because his answer was already sitting in front of him in the form of binders, transcripts, dates, public statements, and a yellow legal pad covered with notes. He took a sip of coffee, set the mug down, opened the thick binder on his desk, and asked the question that immediately turned Schiff's opening attack back toward the man who had delivered it. Senator, when you told America you had more than circumstantial evidence of Russia collusion, were you lying? That was the moment the hearing stopped being about Kennedy's alleged moral authority and became a test of Schiff's own record, because the easiest way to expose the weakness of a lecture about accountability is to place the lecturer's previous words directly beside the evidence and let the contradiction speak for itself. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing had convened that morning under the formal banner of congressional oversight, integrity, and institutional accountability, language broad enough to invite speeches, but specific enough to make personal records fair game once someone chose to claim the high ground. Schiff entered with the bearing of a former prosecutor who understood cameras, pacing, cadence, and the visual grammar of authority, wearing the controlled expression of a politician who had survived years of national controversy and had learned how to project certainty even when the room was hostile. His opening statement ran for several minutes, polished to the point of precision, accusing Kennedy of participating in a broader MAGA project to weaponize congressional oversight while presenting himself as a defender of the rule of law and institutional restraint. Kennedy listened, wrote 3 words on his legal pad, underlined them twice, and allowed Schiff to finish without interruption, which made the next few minutes more brutal because the attack was not answered with another speech but with a sequence of documentary confrontations. When Schiff finished, Kennedy thanked him for the remarks, noted the efficiency of delivering 6 accusations in roughly 4 minutes, and then turned the word accountability against him with the kind of dry Louisiana sarcasm that worked precisely because it was restrained rather than theatrical. The first binder Kennedy opened was read, organized as a timeline running from March 2017 through June 2023, and its purpose was straightforward. Take Schiff's public claims about Trump-Russia collusion, place them in chronological order, and compare those claims against testimony and investigative conclusions that later entered the public record. Kennedy started with Schiff's March 22, 2017 appearance on MSNBC with Chuck Todd, where Todd asked whether the case for Trump-Russia collusion was circumstantial, and Schiff answered, "Actually, no, Chuck. I can tell you that the case is more than that, and I can't go into the particulars, but there is more than circumstantial evidence now." Kennedy did not need to embellish that sentence, because the force came from its certainty, from the fact that Schiff was not describing a suspicion, not merely calling for further investigation, and not carefully distinguishing unresolved intelligence from established evidence. He then moved to Schiff's December 2017 CNN statement, where Schiff said the Russians had offered help, the campaign had accepted help, the Russians had given help, and the president had made full use of that help, another formulation delivered not as tentative possibility, but as fact. Kennedy's point was sharp and narrow. A senior member of Congress with access to classified intelligence had repeatedly spoken to the public with the authority of someone claiming to know what ordinary Americans could not see, and that authority carried a responsibility far heavier than the normal political license to speculate. That distinction mattered because by May 2020, the House Intelligence Committee had released 57 transcripts of witness interviews from the Russia investigation, and those transcripts created a serious problem for the certainty Schiff had projected on television. Kennedy pulled first from the testimony of James Clapper, Barack Obama's Director of National Intelligence, emphasizing that Clapper was neither a Trump partisan nor a Republican messenger, but one of the most senior intelligence officials in the previous administration. Under oath, according to the transcript Kennedy cited, Clapper said he had not seen evidence of collusion, a statement that stood in obvious tension with the public impression Schiff had spent years cultivating. Kennedy then moved through Loretta Lynch, Sally Yates, and Susan Rice, all senior Obama-era officials whose positions placed them close to the national security machinery, examining Russian interference and related questions. The cumulative effect was not dependent on any one witness, because Kennedy's argument was that several officials who were positioned to know what investigators had found did not testify to the kind of collusion evidence Schiff had been publicly suggesting existed. Schiff attempted to redirect toward Russian interference in the 2016 election, but Kennedy cut off that escape route by drawing a distinction that should have been elementary to anyone speaking with prosecutorial precision. Interference and collusion were not interchangeable concepts. Russia's interference was not the point Kennedy was challenging, because the issue was whether Schiff had represented to the public that the Trump campaign had conspired or coordinated with Russia, and whether the evidence actually justified the certainty of those representations. That is where Kennedy's questioning became particularly damaging, because it refused to let Schiff widen the frame whenever the narrower claim became uncomfortable, and it forced the discussion back to the exact words Schiff had used. Kennedy's message was simple without being simplistic. If a politician chooses language as strong as more than circumstantial evidence, then that politician does not get to retreat years later into the safer language of broader foreign interference and pretend the two claims were always the same. Words matter most when they are spoken from positions of institutional trust, and Schiff's problem was that Kennedy had brought the words with him. Then Kennedy reached for the Mueller report. The investigation that had consumed 22 months involved 40 FBI agents, interviewed approximately 500 witnesses, issued roughly 2,800 subpoenas, and cost about $30 million, according to the figures cited in the script. He read the conclusion that the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government, and he presented that sentence as the direct collision between years of public insinuation and the final language of the special counsel's report. Kennedy did not need to argue that Russian interference never occurred, because that would have been a different proposition and an unnecessary distraction from the point he was making about Schiff's repeated statements regarding conspiracy or coordination. Instead, he narrowed the issue further, asking why a politician who had claimed superior access to hidden evidence continued speaking with such confidence even as the visible record failed to produce the definitive collusion case Americans had been told was waiting behind classified doors. The red binder was becoming less a prop than a ledger, each page forcing the hearing back from generalized outrage to specific dates, specific words, and specific records. Kennedy's tone hardened without becoming louder as he accused Schiff of continuing to push a narrative even after Mueller, even after the release of committee transcripts, and even after later scrutiny had raised serious questions about how parts of the Russia investigation had been handled. The accusation was not dressed in euphemism, because Kennedy rejected the softer Washington vocabulary of misstatement, overreach, contextual error, or rhetorical excess, and instead framed the matter as a basic question of whether Schiff had told Americans things he knew the available evidence did not support. That framing was devastating precisely because Schiff had spent years presenting himself as one of Washington's most disciplined voices on intelligence, impeachment, and presidential misconduct. Someone whose entire public authority depended on the assumption that he was choosing his words with prosecutorial care. If those words were careless, his image as a precise investigator suffered, but if they were deliberate, Kennedy's accusation became considerably more severe. Either way, the moral authority Schiff had tried to deny Kennedy at the beginning of the hearing was now being measured against Schiff's own record rather than Schiff's description of himself. Kennedy then produced what the source script described as an internal committee memo dated February 2018, prepared by Schiff's own minority staff, and this document was presented as the sharpest contradiction yet because it allegedly warned that current evidence did not support the public characterization of a direct conspiracy and recommended adjusting messaging to reflect the actual evidentiary posture. If the earlier transcripts raised questions about what witnesses had said, this memo attacked the issue from inside Schiff's own political operation, because Kennedy's argument was that Schiff had been warned by his own staff that the public rhetoric was outrunning the evidence. Kennedy held up the page and drove the implication home without needing to invent another speech. The people working for Schiff had allegedly told him, in writing, to pull the language back, yet the public messaging continued. That was the kind of document that made rhetorical escape difficult, because blaming Republicans, conservative media, Trump allies, or partisan interpretation could not easily explain away advice coming from one's own staff. The question, therefore, became brutally simple. If Schiff's own team believed the evidence did not justify the public characterization, why did Schiff continue presenting himself to television audiences as though the unseen evidence was stronger than what the public record eventually showed? By this point, Schiff's physical control had begun to show small cracks in the source narrative. Not dramatic collapse, not theatrical panic, but the quieter signs of a politician forced to sit still while his own statements were being reconstructed in chronological order. Kennedy did not need shouting because the structure itself was doing the work, moving from public television claims to sworn testimony to Mueller's conclusion, and then to the internal memo described in the script, tightening the circle every time Schiff attempted to broaden the discussion. That method made the exchange more punishing than a conventional partisan shouting match, because yelling creates room for both sides to claim victimhood, while documents create a far narrower battlefield. Schiff had arrived accusing Kennedy of weaponizing institutions, but Kennedy's response was to ask whether Schiff had weaponized the authority of the Intelligence Committee by using its prestige to give public claims a certainty the underlying record did not support. The more Kennedy reduced the argument to dates and documents, the less useful Schiff's opening moral indictment became. Kennedy finally translated the entire Russia-collusion section into the kind of Louisiana analogy that stripped away Washington vocabulary and reduced the dispute to ordinary accountability, comparing it to a man accusing his neighbor for years of stealing cattle only for the accusation to collapse while evidence emerged that the accuser had reason to know his story was unsupported. The point was not elegance, and it was not storytelling for its own sake, but compression. Take years of television appearances, investigations, classified briefings, committee testimony, partisan combat, and institutional jargon, then reduce them to the oldest question in public life, whether a man said something he could actually prove. Schiff responded that he stood by the substance, but Kennedy's answer was immediate and cutting, because standing by what was said was not the same as standing by what was true. With that, Kennedy closed the red binder, ending the first phase not with a declaration of victory, but with the record laid out in front of Schiff and the central contradiction left exposed. The hearing would move next to another binder and another subject, but the foundation had already been established. Schiff came prepared to question Kennedy's moral authority, while Kennedy came prepared to question whether Schiff's own words had ever earned the authority he claimed for himself. Kennedy did not linger over the red binder after closing it, because the point had already been made and repeating it would only weaken the pressure, so he reached for the blue binder and shifted the hearing from Russia to Ukraine without giving Schiff the relief of a reset. The subject was September 26, 2019, when Schiff chaired a House Intelligence Committee hearing involving Acting Director of National Intelligence Joseph Maguire and the whistleblower complaint surrounding President Donald Trump's phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. By then, the White House had released the transcript of the call, meaning the public, the press, and every member of Congress could compare what had actually been said with what Schiff presented from the chairman's seat. Kennedy placed the real transcript on one side of his desk and Schiff's own rendition on the other, not because the visual required explanation, but because two documents sitting side by side can expose a contradiction faster than 10 minutes of political argument. Then he returned to the language Schiff had used in that hearing, language delivered in a way that sounded like a quotation from the president, even though the words themselves did not appear in the transcript. Kennedy read Schiff's version back to him, including the lines about wanting a favor, wanting dirt manufactured on a political opponent, and repeating the demand 7 times, then looked across the room and reduced the issue to its simplest form. The president had not said those words. Schiff attempted to defend the presentation as rhetorical, but Kennedy's answer was immediate because rhetoric was not the problem. Presentation was, and there had been no clear warning before the passage that the chairman was about to dramatize, parody, or invent language for effect. Congressman Mike Turner had challenged Schiff at the time, and Schiff later described his summary as being intended, at least in part, as parody, a defense that only made Kennedy's point sharper because impeachment proceedings were not a comedy stage, and fabricated presidential dialogue did not become harmless merely because the word parody was attached after criticism arrived. Kennedy did not need to stretch the argument beyond what the record in the script already contained because the contrast was sufficient. The transcript existed, Schiff's version existed, and the two did not match. For a politician who had built so much of his national reputation around precision, intelligence, evidence, and prosecutorial discipline, that mismatch was not a minor embarrassment, but another crack in the image of absolute seriousness Schiff had carried into the room. The blue binder did not stop there, because Kennedy next moved to the April 2017 prank call in which 2 Russian comedians known as Vovin and Lexus allegedly posed as a Ukrainian political figure and offered supposed compromising material involving Trump. According to the script, Schiff remained on the call for roughly 8 minutes while the callers described compromising photographs, and he expressed interest in obtaining the supposed material rather than immediately dismissing the approach as obviously fraudulent. Kennedy emphasized that this was not some random backbench congressman with no connection to national security, but the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, a politician who repeatedly presented himself as exceptionally careful about Russian influence, foreign intelligence, and disinformation. Schiff's staff later followed up with the pranksters multiple times before recognizing that the source was fake, which Kennedy used to attack not merely Schiff's judgment, but the glaring contrast between the suspicion Schiff demanded from everyone else and the willingness his own operation showed when the offered material was politically useful. The irony was almost too clean. The man warning America about foreign manipulation had, in the version of events presented by the source script, spent valuable time pursuing fabricated material supplied by comedians pretending to possess exactly the kind of sensational evidence he wanted. Kennedy laid out the communication logs and let the pattern sit there, refusing to dilute it with unnecessary outrage, because the more calmly he described the sequence, the more ridiculous the sequence sounded. His argument was not that Schiff had personally manufactured the prank, because that would have gone beyond the record, but that Schiff's hunger for damaging material had apparently lowered the standard of skepticism he demanded when evaluating claims about Trump. That was the thread connecting the Russia statements, the parody episode, and the prank call. Certainty when accusation served the narrative, improvisation when the evidence fell short, and a remarkable willingness to treat politically explosive claims as worthy of pursuit before basic verification had caught up. Kennedy summarized it in the blunt Louisiana style that had become the rhythm of the hearing, essentially saying that Schiff had failed to produce the collusion proof he had promised, invented presidential language when the actual transcript did not say what he wanted, and then chased fake compromat offered by comedians. By the time Kennedy closed the blue binder, Schiff's polished morning posture had not disappeared completely, but the professional smile was gone, and the hearing had become less about Schiff lecturing Kennedy than Schiff surviving another set of his own records being read back to him. Kennedy then reached for the green binder, and the atmosphere changed because the next section moved away from rhetoric and television statements and into real estate, signatures, mortgage filings, and the kind of paperwork that does not care whether a politician gives a good interview afterward. He began with 2 properties, one in Burbank, California, connected to the state Schiff represented in Congress and later in the Senate, and another in Potomac, Maryland, where many members of Congress maintain residences while working in Washington. Kennedy acknowledged the obvious point that a person can own more than one home, then narrowed the question to the phrase primary residence, because a borrower can own multiple properties, but mortgage documents generally ask for one specific classification. He produced what the source script described as a 2011 mortgage document in which Schiff certified the Maryland property as his primary residence, then placed beside it a campaign-related filing from the same period identifying Schiff as a California resident. Once again, Kennedy arranged the problem visually before arguing it verbally. 2 documents, 1 politician, 2 different representations connected to where he primarily lived. Schiff answered that many members maintained multiple residences, but Kennedy refused to let the discussion expand into congressional custom because custom was irrelevant to what the documents themselves asked. The point was not whether elected officials slept in more than one state during a year. It was whether Schiff had signed financial paperwork treating Maryland as his primary residence while simultaneously maintaining the California residency necessary for the political position he held. Kennedy then cited the referral described in the script from Federal Housing Finance Agency Director William Polt to Attorney General Pam Bondi in May 2025, which alleged that Schiff had falsified bank documents and property records in connection with more favorable loan terms. Kennedy stressed the seriousness of that language without converting an allegation into a conviction because the existence of an investigation was enough for his immediate purpose. Schiff had entered the hearing accusing others of weaponizing institutions while facing questions about documents carrying his own signature. The script further described an ongoing federal inquiry, the involvement of a special attorney, and active grand jury proceedings, all of which Kennedy used to reject Schiff's effort to dismiss the matter as merely politically motivated. The numerical argument came next, with Kennedy citing a February 2009 refinancing of the Maryland property and asserting that primary residence mortgage rates were typically lower than rates for investment properties, producing an estimated difference of roughly $147,000 over 11 years of payments, according to the source narrative. Whether Schiff wanted to call the investigation partisan did not answer Kennedy's narrower question, because partisan motive and document authenticity were separate issues, and Kennedy kept dragging the discussion back to the one thing political rhetoric could not easily dissolve: was Schiff's signature on the paperwork or not? When Schiff did not provide the direct answer Kennedy wanted, Kennedy treated the silence as confirmation because he already had the documents in front of him, and his accusation became almost brutally plain. One signature appeared on papers describing Maryland as primary, while another official context required California residency. This was exactly the kind of contradiction Kennedy's method was designed to exploit. not by announcing a sweeping conclusion first, but by arranging the records until the desired conclusion seemed to emerge from the paper itself. Schiff had spent years asking Americans to trust what he claimed hidden evidence showed, while Kennedy was forcing him to confront evidence that required no security clearance, no anonymous source, and no intelligence briefing, only the ability to read two documents placed next to each other. Kennedy leaned back after presenting the mortgage records, allowing the silence to stretch long enough for the cameras to capture the discomfort the argument had created without adding unnecessary theatrics. The green binder had accomplished something different from the red and blue binders because it moved the hearing from disputes over interpretation into a dispute over concrete personal filings, where Schiff could no longer rely entirely on debates about Russia, impeachment, national security, or presidential conduct. Kennedy's larger attack was becoming unmistakable. A man who arrived claiming authority to define accountability for everyone else was now being asked to explain why his own public statements, congressional conduct, and financial paperwork appeared in Kennedy's presentation to demand explanations he had never convincingly supplied. The next binder would move into donor money, Ed Buck, and the political exploitation of Schiff's own censure, widening the argument again from documents to judgment and from judgment to character. But by the end of the green binder section, Kennedy had already forced the hearing into the territory Schiff had tried to reserve for his opponents, where moral authority was no longer something declared in an opening statement, but something tested against a record. Kennedy reached for the orange binder without ceremony, and that lack of ceremony made the transition feel even more severe because the hearing was no longer moving through abstract disputes about intelligence or interpretations of presidential conduct, but into questions about money, judgment, associations, and the decisions Schiff made when the reputational cost was his own. The name Ed Buck entered the room next, a Democratic donor from West Hollywood who had contributed to Schiff's campaign as well as to other prominent Democrats in California, and Kennedy immediately framed the issue around timing rather than pretending Schiff had personal knowledge of crimes that had not yet been proven. According to the source script, Buck contributed $2,700 to Schiff in 2016, moved through the same political donor ecosystem, appeared at events attended by Democratic figures, and remained part of a fundraising world where access, money, and political networking overlapped in ways that were entirely ordinary until the circumstances surrounding him became impossible to ignore. Kennedy was careful to say he was not accusing Schiff of knowing what Buck was doing behind closed doors, because the sharper argument did not require that leap and would have been weakened by it. The question Kennedy wanted to force was narrower and harder to evade. Once the warning signs became public, how long did Schiff keep the money, and what did that delay say about the standard of accountability Schiff demanded from himself compared with the standard he demanded from everyone else? Kennedy then laid out the deaths described in the source, beginning with Gemmel Moore, 26 years old, who was found dead in Buck's apartment in July 2017 after a methamphetamine overdose that was initially ruled accidental. He moved next to Timothy Dean, 55 years old, who was found dead in the same apartment in January 2019 under circumstances again involving methamphetamine, producing a pattern that looked more disturbing with every date Kennedy read aloud. The source narrative then described a third victim who nearly died in September 2019, the event that finally preceded Buck's arrest and the federal prosecution that ultimately resulted in convictions on 9 felony counts. Buck was later sentenced to 30 years in federal prison after prosecutors established that he had exploited vulnerable men, including homeless black men, using drugs and sexual coercion in conduct so predatory that the facts required little rhetorical decoration. Kennedy's argument, therefore, did not depend on guilt by association, because he was not saying Schiff shared Buck's crimes. He was saying Schiff's campaign held money from a donor tied to an escalating public scandal until September 2019, long after the first death and months after the second. Schiff responded that he had donated the money to charity after Buck's arrest, And Kennedy seized on the phrase after his arrest because that timing was precisely the issue he wanted exposed. The first death had occurred more than 2 years earlier, the second death had occurred 8 months before the arrest, and yet the campaign money remained untouched until the scandal crossed the threshold from disturbing public allegations into federal criminal action. Kennedy then referred to internal fundraising calendars and Democratic donor events in the West Hollywood orbit, saying that campaign participation in several events connected to Buck's broader social network continued through 2018, another detail he used to challenge the image of relentless vigilance Schiff projected in other contexts. Again, the attack was not that Schiff personally knew Buck's crimes, and Kennedy made that limitation explicit, but that a politician who had built a brand around warning America about danger, corruption, hidden motives, and compromised actors seemed remarkably slow to apply comparable suspicion inside his own donor environment. That asymmetry was becoming the central accusation of the entire hearing. Schiff's instincts were aggressive when scrutiny pointed outward and far more forgiving when the facts threatened to point inward. Kennedy then pivoted from donor money to institutional punishment, opening the next section with the House censure of Schiff on June 21, 2023, when the chamber voted 213 to 209 to formally condemn his conduct. The resolution required Schiff to stand in the well of the House while the censure was read, an extraordinary rebuke that the source script connected to accusations involving falsehoods, misrepresentations, and abuses related to sensitive information. Kennedy did not dwell on the ceremonial humiliation itself because the part that interested him came immediately afterward when Schiff's campaign began turning the censure into fundraising material. According to the script, Schiff's operation sent 36 fundraising emails mentioning the censure during the relevant quarter and raised $8.1 million, transforming what was designed as institutional condemnation into a highly effective campaign money engine. To Kennedy, that was not resilience or political savvy worth admiring. It was the conversion of punishment into profit, the ability to take an official rebuke and repackage it as proof of persecution before the public had even finished reading what the House had condemned. Kennedy pulled out one of the fundraising emails sent the same day as the censure and highlighted the subject line, "I won't be silenced," using it to expose what he saw as another layer of political theater. Nobody had literally silenced Schiff, Kennedy argued through the structure of his questioning, because Schiff remained a member of Congress, remained free to speak, remained visible on television, and was actively asking supporters for money while claiming he was being suppressed. The House had censured him, and instead of treating that action as a moment requiring reflection, his campaign turned the event into another narrative of victimhood, another reason for supporters to open their wallets, and another opportunity to convert controversy into political capital. Kennedy sharpened the mockery with the Louisiana image already contained in the source, comparing the situation to a child sent to the principal who, rather than coming home chastened, sells tickets to the whipping and thanks everyone who paid to watch. The point landed because it compressed the entire fundraising strategy into one crude but memorable proposition. Schiff had not merely endured institutional punishment, he had monetized it. By the time Kennedy closed the orange binder, the pattern he wanted the room to see had been fully assembled across multiple subjects, and he no longer needed a document in his hand to explain what the documents were supposed to mean. He removed his reading glasses, folded them, placed them on the dais, and, for the first time that morning, spoke without relying on binders, tabs, printouts, transcripts, or highlighted pages, because the documentary phase was over and the summation had begun. Schiff had entered calling Kennedy a mega instrument and accusing him of contributing to the weaponization of institutions, positioning himself as the defender of democratic norms and the responsible adult standing between the country and partisan abuse. Kennedy's response was to take that self-description apart piece by piece, not by inventing a competing biography, but by assembling the episodes already introduced in the hearing and forcing them into a single record. The issue was no longer whether any one controversy could be explained away, because Kennedy's case rested on accumulation, the weight produced when one disputed episode was followed by another, then another, until the explanations themselves began to look repetitive. Kennedy raised one finger and returned to Russia, reminding Schiff that he had told Americans there was more than circumstantial evidence of collusion, even though senior Obama administration officials later testified that they had not seen such evidence. He raised a second finger and returned to the Ukraine hearing, where Schiff had presented invented presidential language and later defended the passage as parody after being challenged over the fact that the actual transcript did not contain those words. A third finger brought back the prank call, the episode where Russian comedians offered fake compromising material, and Schiff's operation followed up with the supposed source before discovering that the entire thing was a hoax. A fourth finger returned the hearing to the mortgage documents, the competing primary residence representations, the federal referral, the ongoing investigation described in the source, and the signatures Kennedy had placed beside one another earlier in the hearing. By the time Kennedy opened his entire hand for the fifth point, the argument was no longer about one error or one political dispute, but about a record that Kennedy presented as a repeated collision between Schiff's public image and Schiff's own conduct. The fifth point combined Ed Buck with the censure and fundraising, joining two subjects that looked different on the surface but served the same larger accusation about standards, consequences, and self-interest. Kennedy reminded Schiff that his campaign had retained Buck's donation until after two men were dead and a third victim had nearly died, then moved immediately into the 36 fundraising emails sent after the House censure and the millions of dollars raised around an event Schiff called a badge of honor. The message was savage without needing extra volume. Schiff had repeatedly transformed moments that should have demanded explanation into opportunities to declare himself persecuted, morally superior, or politically strengthened. Every controversy became another stage on which Schiff could cast himself as the guardian of truth under attack. And Kennedy's purpose was to strip that role away by forcing attention back onto the inconvenient details the larger speeches tended to obscure. This was the culmination of everything the binders had been building toward, because Kennedy was no longer asking whether Schiff could answer each charge separately, but whether the pattern itself destroyed the authority of the man who had arrived, lecturing everyone else about accountability. Then Kennedy delivered the line that reduced the entire hearing to one image. Accountability was not a speech, not a press conference, and not a weapon reserved for political opponents, but a mirror. The sting came from the implication that Schiff had spent years holding that mirror up to presidents, Republicans, Trump allies, conservative institutions, and anyone else he believed had violated the standards he claimed to defend, while refusing to spend comparable time looking at his own reflection. Schiff attempted to respond by invoking the career he had dedicated to public service and accountability, but Kennedy cut back to the evidence already placed on the table rather than allowing the exchange to become another biography contest. Based on the record Kennedy had presented, he argued that Schiff's career was marked not merely by aggressive opposition to Trump, but by stories that repeatedly outran the facts, claims that became harder to defend once the underlying documents were visible, and controversies that Schiff then used to reinforce his political brand. The accusation was not that Schiff lacked intelligence or skill, because Kennedy's entire performance suggested the opposite, that Schiff was highly skilled at managing narratives, cameras, institutions, and political conflict, which made the discrepancies between presentation and record even less forgivable. Kennedy had reached the point where another binder would have been redundant, because the papers had already done their work, and the hearing now rested on the gap between the man Schiff claimed to be and the record Kennedy had assembled in front of him. Schiff's opening accusation about weaponization had not disappeared, but it had become background noise beside the dates, transcripts, filings, donor records, censure resolution, fundraising emails, and public statements that Kennedy kept returning to whenever Schiff tried to widen the argument. The structure was ruthlessly simple. Let Schiff speak in abstractions, then answer with specifics. Let Schiff invoke institutions, then answer with documents. Let Schiff invoke morality, then answer with his own record. Kennedy did not need to tell the room that Schiff's credibility was damaged, because he had spent the hearing constructing the conditions in which the audience could arrive at that conclusion without being ordered to do so. And with the binders closed, the glasses folded, and the documentary case assembled, Kennedy moved toward the final analogy that would reduce 7 years of Schiff's public persona to a single Louisiana image the hearing room would not soon forget. Kennedy did not reach for another binder because by then the papers had already done everything he needed them to do, and instead he shifted into the final analogy contained in the source, the story of a peacock strutting across a farm outside Baton Rouge with an enormous tail spread wide enough to command attention from everyone in the yard. From the front, the bird looked magnificent, colorful, theatrical, impossible to ignore, exactly the kind of spectacle designed to make observers focus on display rather than substance. But when the farmer's wife walked behind the bird, she saw what the front-facing performance concealed, that the feathers were enormous while the creature carrying them was far smaller and far less impressive than the image it projected. Kennedy applied the image directly to Schiff's years of Russia allegations, impeachment appearances, television interviews, censure fights, and fundraising campaigns, describing them as feathers, dramatic and highly visible, but ultimately dependent on the audience never walking around to inspect what stood behind the display. Then he brought the analogy to its point without raising his voice, declaring that America had finally walked behind the peacock, and with that, he placed both hands flat on the dais and ended the examination with no further questions. The hearing room remained silent for several seconds after Kennedy finished, a pause long enough to become part of the moment because nobody rushed to fill the space with applause, protest, or procedural noise. Chairman Grassley eventually turned back toward Schiff and offered him the opportunity to respond, while Schiff's counsel leaned toward him and spoke quietly at the witness table. Schiff cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, faced the cameras, and returned to the defense he had used from the beginning, saying the hearing demonstrated the same institutional weaponization he had warned about in his opening statement. He added that he intended to address the issues through the appropriate channels, a formulation that avoided walking back his broader accusations while also avoiding direct answers to the specific documents Kennedy had spent the hearing placing into the record. The response was controlled and professional, but in the structure of the source, it sounded thin because the confrontation had moved far beyond general complaints about partisanship and into a series of discrete questions involving Schiff's own words, his own signatures, and his own political choices. Schiff gathered his papers more slowly than he had entered, his staff closed around him as he moved toward the exit, and reporters immediately began shouting questions about the mortgage documents, the prank call, the censure, and whether he intended to release additional records. His communications team stepped between him and the cameras and promised a statement later that day, effectively ending the corridor exchange without giving reporters the direct answers they were demanding. When the statement arrived roughly 4 hours later, the source described it as 3 paragraphs attacking the hearing as partisan and accusing Republicans of distracting from broader threats to democracy. What the statement did not do was address the central Russia evidence timeline, the parody controversy, the prank call, the mortgage paperwork, or the Ed Buck donation issue that Kennedy had raised. That omission became part of the criticism itself, because once specific questions have been asked in public, answering with generalized outrage only sharpens the impression that the details are being avoided. The source then moves rapidly into the digital reaction, portraying the hearing as a viral political spectacle almost immediately after it ended, with clips circulating under phrases taken from Kennedy's questioning and the peacock analogy spreading across conservative social media. Two houses, one signature became a recurring slogan around the mortgage issue, while the word parody resurfaced as a shorthand attack on Schiff's handling of the Ukraine call hearing. The peacock image became the most durable symbol because it reduced a complicated argument about public persona, evidence, and political performance into a visual metaphor that required almost no explanation once viewers had heard Kennedy deliver it. Commentators praised Kennedy's method for relying on documents, pauses, chronology, and Schiff's own previous statements instead of turning the exchange into another screaming match built for cable television. In the source's framing, that disciplined approach became the entire reason the hearing landed so hard. The more Schiff wanted to characterize the proceeding as partisan theater, the more Kennedy's refusal to perform like a partisan brawler made that defense difficult to sustain. Television panels then attempted to contextualize the Russia statements, the Ukraine hearing, and the mortgage allegations, but the source presents those efforts as increasingly uncomfortable because every broad defense kept running into the exact language Kennedy had placed on screen. A former Obama national security official was described as acknowledging that Schiff had gone too far with the collusion claims, a concession that conservative outlets immediately amplified because it appeared to come from someone outside Kennedy's political camp. The source then portrays political consequences accumulating over the following days and weeks, including declining support among independents and moderate Democrats, increased attention on the Maryland mortgage investigation, and private concern among Democratic senators about Schiff's need to address the property issue directly. It also describes a preliminary ethics inquiry and the emergence of a potential California primary challenger, framing those developments as evidence that Kennedy's attack had moved beyond a single viral hearing into a broader credibility problem. Whether every political effect would ultimately endure was left open by the source, but within its narrative, the important point was that Schiff could no longer count on the controversy disappearing after one hostile news cycle. The script also depicts Schiff's allies responding cautiously, offering general statements against political persecution while largely avoiding detailed defenses of the individual charges Kennedy had presented. That distinction matters inside the source's argument because defending Schiff in the abstract was easy, while defending every specific claim required confronting the Russia language, the parody explanation, the prank call, the mortgage records, the donor timeline, and the fundraising after censure one by one. Schiff's own social media silence was therefore portrayed as especially revealing, with the normally aggressive digital fighter disappearing for days before returning with a controlled policy video rather than a direct response to the hearing. The source interprets that silence not as proof of guilt, but as a political tell, the kind of retreat that becomes conspicuous precisely because it is so different from a politician's normal behavior. By the second week, progressive media in the source had largely moved to other stories, which the script treats as another quiet acknowledgement that keeping every detail alive was doing Schiff more harm than good. Kennedy, by contrast, is described as refusing to stage a victory tour, returning to routine Senate work and brushing aside the suggestion that he had done anything extraordinary. When asked about the hearing, he reduced his own role to something almost comically simple. He had read public documents aloud and allowed Schiff's words to collide with Schiff's record. That answer reinforced the central theme the source had been building from the first binder onward, that Kennedy's power in the exchange did not come from louder rhetoric, but from preparation, sequencing, and the discipline to stop talking once the evidence had been placed in front of the audience. The script then carries that lesson outside Washington describing a community college government class in Lafayette where a professor plays the hearing for students and asks why the questioning worked so effectively. The answer given by a student becomes the source's final analytical point that Kennedy did not constantly order the audience what to think. He showed them the material and let the contradiction do the persuading. The source repeats the same idea through a retired Louisiana oil field worker watching from home who reacts most strongly not to the insults or the politics, but to the two mortgage documents sitting beside each other. For him, the entire controversy compresses into two pieces of paper and one unanswered problem, which is exactly the reduction Kennedy had been engineering throughout the hearing. When the peacock analogy arrives, the man laughs because he recognizes the style instantly, the old Louisiana habit of using a simple country image to finish an argument that has already been proven by harder evidence. The lesson is not that metaphor replaces proof, but the opposite. Metaphor works only after the proof has been assembled, because then the image becomes a seal placed over an argument the audience already understands. Kennedy's performance in The Source is therefore presented as a demonstration that volume, outrage, television polish, and social media speed become secondary once someone arrives with the record organized and knows exactly when to stop speaking. By the final stretch, the script turns openly toward the audience and frames the confrontation as a collision between performance and preparation, between a politician skilled at television and a politician armed with binders, transcripts, and a filing cabinet. The source invites viewers to choose the moment that struck hardest, whether the more than circumstantial evidence timeline, the parody episode, the mortgage documents, or the peacock analogy, and then returns to the claim that Schiff's problems are not over because the mortgage matter and other scrutiny remain active within the narrative. It closes by praising veterans, teachers, and citizens who still believe evidence should carry more weight than eloquence, then returns one final time to the image of Kennedy alone in his office, with reading glasses, a yellow legal pad, and another stack of briefing papers waiting for the next hearing. Schiff had arrived intending to lecture. Kennedy had arrived intending to respond, and the script's verdict is that only one of them had brought the receipts necessary to survive the confrontation. Peacocks may look impressive from the front, but the source leaves the audience with Kennedy's larger point. Truth does not depend on the angle, and no amount of feathers can permanently hide what the documents show.